this series called Longings, the desires of our hearts. We got together 2 weeks ago and we talked about how one of the most, if not the most primary longing of our hearts is to feel intimacy with God. And oftentimes that intimacy is expressed in our desire to have love and romantic relationships and connections with other people. But those are just an expression of the intimacy that you and I are built for and are made for. It's like when you get quality time with a good friend and they leave and you're just like, I want this again. These longings come out in our lives, and if we're not slow and careful to name them and to accept that these feelings, these desires, these longings that we have are of God, we'll attach them to things that will not fulfill us, like a relationship with the King of Kings and Lord of Lords will. He gave us his Spirit. He promised it to us. It's like wind in our sails. I think sometimes we settle for knowledge instead of intimacy. And I have this fear. God has done such a deep work in my own personal life in this over the last 8 months. I have this fear that if we're too quick to fight as the mask comes off and the vaccines go out and things reopen, we can go to Disneyland. Heck yeah, I'd hate Disneyland, but I'm pumped on Disneyland. I'm like, yes, let's go to Disneyland. Also, I need a donation. We're going to do a love offering so I can take my kids to Disneyland. I fear that as the masks come off and life feels normal, that we'll forget what God taught us in the desert. And we see this throughout Israel's history in the book of Exodus. I am not at all anywhere tied to my notes, so I feel bad for the people who are like, what verse is this? We see this in the story of the Israelites as they leave their time in the desert and ultimately end up in slavery. We see that they constantly revert back to the tendencies and the things that kept them going when God felt far away, when God felt distant. But God did this work in their hearts in the desert. They would see him. He put physical markers out in front of them and said, here's the way that I'd like you to go. This is the way I want you to go. And I feel in my own soul this desire to kind of forego the things God has taught me and to go back to what I used to know. And we cannot do that. We will not do that. As we talk about things, practically speaking, as a young adults ministry, we talk about things like community groups or serving. We won't quit on these things. This is the work that God has done in our hearts as facilitators of this awesome, stinking, rad ministry. We have to serve one another. We have to build up godly community with one another. Why? Because I realized I didn't have it. And in realizing I didn't have it, I turned to things to try and replace that longing, that desire in my heart for something that could just make me feel better. Remember those like brief 2 weeks in June where things were reopened? And it was like, oh, we can eat in a restaurant, chips and salsa, margaritas, no tequila, whatever, right? Like however you do your thing. Messages are recorded now. I'm still trying to catch up to that. No tequila in the margaritas. We just like lime juice. Here's the point. I remember those 2 weeks and then it was taken away and it felt like it was like, whoa, what? And then back to the desert we went, at least where we live, right? At least in Southern California. And by desert, I mean this, a massive disruption that changed life as we knew it. But I think God does some of his best work in the desert. I think God does some of the best discipling in the desert. We have an opportunity to be discipled as things have been taken away to replace them with God. And that's what's at the core of this study of longings. We want to replace, we want to call out, I have a longing for intimacy as a human being. I have a desire to know and be known, but I will never feel the fulfillment of that longing in my life until I attach it to God. So what's the next step in that? The next step in that comes in human relationships. And there's much to be said on the topic of human relationships. We can go into a sermon series on sex or love or dating, and we have, and we'll get to that eventually. But tonight, the longing I want to specifically call out is what I'm going to call the longing for friendship. For friendship. How many of us, in a moment of honesty, vulnerability, felt completely let down by our friends this year during the pandemic? Maybe you experienced loneliness this year during the pandemic. Raise your hand. This is a desire of us as humans. This is a desire. Why? Because like we talked 2 weeks ago, we're made in the image of a God who exists within the context of community. That thumbprint is on our very souls. And so if we're not careful to stop and take inventory of the things that we long for, we're going to fill it with things. Now, oftentimes we fill this longing for friendship with shallow friendship. Enneagram type 7. Not the biggest fan of the Enneagram because I'm way more than a 7. Like I'm a 10. I don't think that's on the Enneagram scale. Like don't reduce me to a number. But for the sake of conversation, I'm like Mr. Outgoing guy. At least I thought I was. The more I get to know myself, the more I'm like, I kind of want to be alone right now. It's kind of nice. Maybe it's the 4 kids. I'm not sure. But alone time is very nice. This isn't a deep moment. I'm trying to remember where I was going. Yes, that's what it was. I think sometimes we attach our desire for friendship to shallow friendship, meaning my extroverted nature wants to just be around people, so let's go out for dinner. My extroverted self wants to be around people. Let's watch a movie. My extroverted self wants to hang out. Let's go play a sport. Let's go golf together. Let's do whatever. Like that's what I want. And I always leave those moments after prolonged times in a shallow friendship, disappointed and desiring something deeper for my own life. Why? Because all those things are good. Dinner with friends, entertainment, enjoyment, fulfillment, fun, laughter, absolutely. But there's a depth to our friendship that God desires. How do we know this? Because as we read throughout the pages of Scripture, which is the best example for us to understand who this God is that we're singing to and talking about, we see that the family of God had spiritual depth to it. And I think if we're honest, we won't do a hand raise because maybe your best friend's in the room and you're like, I don't know. Like if I were to say, like, do you feel like you have spiritual friendship? Do you feel like your friendships have depth? Do you feel like you have someone that you can share the most inner sin struggle that you're going through vulnerably? Do you have someone who you feel like listens when you share your heart? Do you have someone who, when you talk about Jesus and what the Spirit of God is doing in your life, it doesn't feel awkward and weird? Do you have someone in your life that you can confide in, that can encourage you, that can pick you up? We're going to look at a few verses in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and then we're going to end a little different than we normally would for a yam, but Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Now, Ecclesiastes is a wisdom book. It's in the Old Testament. Never be ashamed if you have your Bible. Please have your Bible. Turn it on, type it in, or if you use an old school one like me, Ecclesiastes comes right after Proverbs, written by the same guy, a dude named Solomon, who's known as a wise guy, meaning he learned a lot, shares the wisdom from those learnings. Ecclesiastes, by the way, is a fascinating book to study. If you're like, man, I just don't know what to do in my quiet times, I'd say go here, check it out. It's really good stuff. If you ever have questions, come talk to me and we can Google it together. Okay. He says this at the end of chapter 4 on friendlessness. Now, there's going to be a couple tendencies as I share this. There's going to be a couple tendencies. One, the tendency is going to be to personify these things immediately, put a face and a name to the points that I bring up. Let's hold off on doing that until the end. Right? We don't want to jump to conclusions. We really want to take time to consider, are friends like this something that I have in my life these days? The second thing we're going to want to do, because in the Old Testament, relationships looked a little different. Full disclosure, the second thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to apply a sexual lens to the things that I'm sharing here. It's going to seem like it's there, but it's not there. I promise it's not there. You've got to remember the culture in which this was written. Some of these tendencies and practices meant something different than they would today. So with those two things in mind, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, I'll read through them and we'll break them down and then we're going to do something kind of fun. It says this, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So Solomon, the wisdom guy, he shares at the end of chapter 4, obviously we know that chapter 4 wasn't a thing when he wrote it, but he ends at the end of this part of his writing just going into kind of a tangent on friendship. And he breaks down these things about friendship that I want to just pull out 3 good things for us to consider as one of the longings in our own hearts is a desire to have spiritual friendship. Spiritual friendship defined, by the way, will make it really simple. Spiritual friendship defined, it's going to be people who help you grow in your faith. Also people that you help grow in their faith. But just like intimacy was to know God and to be known, we don't want to make friendship this one-sided thing where it's like, well, you don't help me grow. Well, you don't help me grow. In our desire to be deep spiritually with our friends, close ones, the few, not the crowd, the few, we want people that build us up as we build them up. We want people who encourage us as we encourage them. This is spiritual friendship. I have this in my life, and I want to share this full disclosure. I'm not sharing this to brag because I know, based off the show of hands and even what I have felt in my life at times, that this can be sort of a weird flex, and I mean that with all sincerity. But I want to talk about my closest friends. I don't want to do this in a way to make anyone who's struggling with loneliness be like, oh, cool, man, thanks a lot. But I want to share this to go, here's what this has meant to me, so that as we walk out of this room tonight, you can take note of what spiritual friendship could look like. Or like in the same way I love to bring my family here so that maybe for those of you who are paying attention, you could see how a family operates, even if it's just in the way they sit down and worship or you come and talk to them. I love to have my family here. I want to model that well as best as humanly possible. I want to do the same with friendship really quick. So I have a picture. This picture is of me and my friends this fall. This fall, we rented hotel rooms. Look how happy I am right there. That's a happy guy. This fall, we went to Palm Springs. We rented a block of rooms, and me and all my best friends and their families, who a lot of us, we haven't even met each other's kids, but the whole time we're like, which one's that again? Mostly me, because I have all the kids. And we went and we hung out, and it's something that has meant so much to me. So when I graduated high school, I entered into this program up at Hume Lake where I was essentially discipled in the ways of Jesus. I lived in the context of community, 54 other people, for a year-long program where I learned about the scriptures, I learned about the ways of Jesus, we served alongside of each other, and while I was there, I met who would become my best friends. Here's what happened. We graduated the program, and we'd become such close friends that we decided we got to keep this going. And this is sort of like, I'll date myself. This is sort of pre-social media. MySpace was kind of the thing, but it was just to like find bands. Like it wasn't exactly like, and I may have sent Katie a bunch of MySpace messages, but that wasn't exactly like, we didn't realize the potential yet, you know? We didn't realize the potential we had at our fingertips with MySpace, not like you do with Facebook, so on and so forth. And so we decided to stay connected. So what did we do? We planned every year we're gonna go camping together. And we've done it every year for 13 years. We've gone camping together as friends. And so what we did was we kind of put a code of conduct into this camping trip. We're gonna have a good time. We're gonna live it up. It's gonna be a blast, but we're also gonna make sure we check in on each other's souls. How are you doing? How is your marriage for those of us who were married? How are your children? How are you as a parent? We carved out intentional time and intentional space to be spiritual friends with one another. It didn't always come easy. There were years where borderline fistfights broke out because we had disagreements. There were years where in the middle of the woods, people are looking for Ubers because someone got their feelings hurt. But the point in Uber, by the way, the Uber didn't come. So Nate had to suck it up. Take that. That's a real story. It's actually really funny. We're recorded now. My bad. He wouldn't watch. He doesn't love God as much as I do. Here's the long point. I could talk for hours about how much these guys mean to me. Here's the point. I want to share what I've learned through having deep spiritual friendship with these guys and also my wife. Now, that's another conversation for another day, but before Katie and I ever did anything, we had a friendship. So let's just tuck in some quick dating advice. You see someone you really like, be friends. Because if you get married, you're really gonna wanna have a friend. You're gonna really want that friend. Not just someone to be physically intimate with, you're gonna want a friend. Because that part doesn't happen as often, guys, as you're probably thinking. So it's really good to have a friend, right? Because then when you travel, you're like, it's my best friend. When you're raising kids, you're like, I'm doing this with my best friend. So quick dating advice in here, not a dating series. I actually said we weren't gonna do it, but here we are. form a friendship first. Don't want anything out of that friendship except to love and get to know and serve alongside one another. The same thing goes with spiritual friendships. Now, I have camaraderie with these dudes. You don't have to keep the picture up. I have camaraderie with them, but how did that come? It came through us intentionally pursuing God and each other. It came with us intentionally pursuing what spiritual depth looked like, what it meant to grow in our faith while we did so alongside of one another. Now, these days, we all live hundreds of miles apart, but there's times where we all live together. There's times where a couple of us live together. So what's kept it going? It's that intention to go, how are you doing? How can I pray for you? How are you in your life? How are you doing overall? And not just keeping it surface level and not just keeping it shallow. We've gone deep with one another. So back to this passage, okay? Back to this passage. 3 things that I see here for those of us who are longing for and desiring spiritual friendship. Let me make a case for why I believe that this is such an important longing to name so that we can embrace it and introduce it into our lives. The first one, he says, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. Simply put, spiritual friends are the kinds that pick you up when you've fallen down. Let's unpack the analogy here. What does falling down look like? Maybe you've gone through a struggle with physical help. A friend is someone who can be there to help you. A dear friend of mine lost her husband about a month ago, and her friends have been by her side day and night for almost a month. They're helping hold her up when she's too tired to do so on her own. One of the things that I try to work into my parenting, because no one told me, and it's been a cruel, cruel joke as I've learned this about life, but life doesn't care about your feelings. You're gonna suffer loss. You're gonna lose money. You're gonna lose friends. Things are gonna hurt. Your brother's gonna die. Your parents are gonna get divorced. Like, these are all the things that I went through, and no one along the way stopped and said, life's gonna be really hard. Spiritual friends are there to hold you up when life is hard. I'm so thankful for the friends that I have, because when my life has been hard, they have held me up, and I've had the privilege to do that for them as well. Second point, verse 11. He says, also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Now, this is the part where I said we're going to want to apply a sexual lens to this. That's not exactly the point here, because he's talking about friendship. The idea here is let's call it what it is. Loneliness is so cold. Loneliness is cold. It's empty. It's tiresome. Loneliness makes us feel lost. Loneliness makes us feel less than. The warmth of a friendship, the embrace of a hi, how are you doing? A random FaceTime call, a text message. The warmth of spending quality time together is something that nothing else in life can replace. Now, you might be thinking, I have friends, but they're not believers. That's totally okay. Not at all am I the pastor that's like, you shouldn't hang out with non-believers. That's so dumb. That's the worst theology I've heard on the topic of relationships ever. Why? Because the scriptures say, how will they hear? How will they know? How beautiful are the feet of those who share good news? We should absolutely be friends with people who don't know God. We should absolutely be the best friends to people who are far from God. Why? Because we can model this for them. And it's not even that the goal is like that we want to work them so that we can do some sales pitch. Now, have you heard of Jesus? No. Let me tell you about this guy I know. Water to wine, anyone? You know, and you're like, I think sometimes we approach our faith and the sharing of our faith like, and no offense here, like people who sell essential oils, you know? Where it's just like this cryptic post that's like, hey, sweet opportunity, DM me. And no one's DMing you. Everyone knows what that means. And if I have to shove eucalyptus down my drain one more time, I'm cutting off the auto ship on this stuff. It ain't happening. Sometimes we treat the sharing of our faith that way. You know what's really different? Hey, here's something that's meant a lot to me. I know you know where I stand with God, but are you cool if I pray for you? Because it seems like you're having a hard time. No? That's okay. I'm still going to pray for you, but I won't do it in a way that makes you uncomfortable. I'll do it at home or in my car or whatever. No? Get behind me, Satan. I'm just kidding. Right? There's ways to be friends. Now, these aren't the friends that we want to lean on to be our spiritual friends. To go back to that definition, these are friends that we want to have because everyone needs a friend. Everyone needs the warm embrace of not feeling lonely. Everyone needs to feel lifted up when they're hurting. Someone not having God in their life is no excuse to not show them love. That's the antithesis of the gospel. We are loved, therefore we love those around us. So that's a really important thing, but here's the deal. There's times in my own faith where I've felt spiritually cold. And the encouragement from my friends, the ones I showed you the pictures of, has meant the world to me. There's times where I've gone through stuff that's so hard and difficult, where I just cry my eyes out, or I'm so angry and I'm thankful to have someone who can physically give me a hug. Or I'm thankful to have someone who can shoot a text and say, I know this is hard, I'm in it with you. And I'm so thankful that I get to be that for other people. So the first was spiritual friends hold us up. The second is they keep us warm. That is loneliness. That's what we're talking about, all right? So don't get weird on me. Okay. Friends with benefits is not what we're talking about. Again, I'll call it what it is. You're like, oh, warmth, huh? You want to be my spiritual friend? Keep me warm? Nope. Different kind of spiritual friend. Again, get behind me, Satan. That's not what we're talking about. All right. Verse 12. Why did I push this down so low? Okay. I'm like, I wear reading glasses now, and I feel like such a dork wearing them on stage, so I'm like, I got this. No offense to reading glasses people, by the way. Let me just warn you, reading glasses are really awesome. And my dog chewed up 2 pairs, and I can't afford to buy another pair. So if you happen to have a giant pair of reading glasses lying around, holla. Okay, last one. Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. There's like 4 sermons in here, and I've heard at least 3 of them. I'm not going to do that to you. Here's the point. The point is this. Spiritual friends make us strong. They give us strength. Different than holding us up when they're weak, there's something about walking into a hard situation knowing that you have someone who's on your side, who you know is fasting and praying for you, who you know has your best spiritual interest. What the desire of your soul is, the longing of your soul is the same as theirs. And you can go into a world which Scripture says is riddled with spiritual battles, is riddled with darkness, knowing that you have someone on your side there to be with you through the thick and the thin. In December of 2016, we got a phone call. It was the hardest day of my life. In fact, we had a friend down a few weeks ago, and she was reminding us of like the worst day, the time I questioned God the most, was when you got that phone call. And it was a phone call that came at about 5 p.m. at the end of someone's workday, which to me meant you don't want me asking questions about how this hellish situation has been put upon me. It was the phone call where we were told Maylee was going to be moved from our home and we would have to say goodbye to her forever. At this point, she'd been with us for 7 months. She's calling us mom and dad. We'd grown attached to her. It was difficult. It was hard. But what didn't make sense to me was how someone can just make a phone call and make that kind of choice. That someone waited until the end of the day to make a phone call that was really difficult. And I was willing to accept the situation. I was willing to accept that God was still in control, that God had her best interest in mind, that maybe he was working in her previous situation, and maybe there's a miracle going on. I was willing to accept all of that. But I was also really pissed off. I was also angry. I was also sad. I was also hurting. Why? Because I'm a human, and I loved this little one deeply. So I called my friend. I barely had words to speak, and I just hung up, not even knowing what would happen. He came over. And for the next 4 hours, he sat in our room on the bedroom floor and just cried with me and Katie and prayed for us and offered strength. You're going to face times that are difficult and hard. And having a friend who paces with you in your love for God, who paces with you in your desire to be Spirit-led and Spirit-formed, and paces with you in your knowledge and understanding of Scripture, having a friend like that is so helpful when you're weak, because they become your strength. It's not a shallow friendship, it's a spiritual friendship.